Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. And today, we got some really fun stuff, starting with our exclusive MTGGoldfish preview card. But we got a bunch of other stuff that's really sweet as well, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Kamigawa Neon Dynasty cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. Number one, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you'll find them all over at mtgpreviews.com, sortable, filterable, updated regularly, so definitely check that out. Number two, if you need some Kamigawa cards of your own, you can get them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish and even get a free MTG Goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes and they'll hook you up. Anyway, let's talk Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. So first up today, we have our exclusive MTG Goldfish preview card for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, thanks to Wizards for hooking us up, and that is Weaver of Harmony. So Weaver of Harmony, I just did a full video specifically about this card, so I'm not going to break it all down again here. It'd be a little redundant. Instead, click on the card and watch that video or the link in the description to see all the shenanigans this card can enable in standard and in older formats. But it is a 2-mana 2/2 enchantment creature, a Snake Druid. It's an enchantment creature lord, giving your other enchantment creatures +1/+1, and then most excitingly, for 1 mana, you can tap it and copy an activated or triggered ability from an enchantment source. So this card, in standard, I think is mostly a value card. Copying your Saga triggers, let's say, is a pretty sweet line. Copying your Necroduality triggers to make even more zombies or whatever. In older formats, or in Commander, there are some infinite combos with this card, mostly involving things like Jeskai Ascendancy or Awakening, enchantments that have a untap trigger. If you have an untap trigger, and then you have some number of mana dorks on the battlefield, so you can keep paying for Weaver of Harmony, you can trigger your enchantment with the untap trigger, copy it with Weaver of Harmony, untap your Weaver of Harmony with that trigger still in the stack, and then using your mana dork mana, which is still being untapped, you can just keep copying that trigger again and again and again to make infinite mana if you get a bunch of mana dorks to do all these untapped shenanigans. So I think that's the most busted thing you can do with this card. It's like literally a 2-card combo with Awakening. This plus Awakening just goes infinite on someone's upkeep, which is awkward. You need the instant speed way to win, but it does go infinite in a commander deck. So definitely a really cool card. If you want to hear more about it, as I mentioned before, definitely check out the full video that is linked in the description. Next up, this card, we got Agino Uprising, a card that I think is probably pretty bad. It is Boros mana, red and white and X, for a sorcery that makes X 2/2 white samurai creature tokens with vigilance, and they gain haste and menace until end of turn. That sounds pretty good. The problem is each opponent creates X -1 2/2 white samurai creature tokens with vigilance. So this is basically Finale of Glory, with the upside that your creatures get haste and menace, but the huge downside that you're also giving all your opponents these tokens, which is not very exciting. So if you think about how this card works, like think about how it scales. If you cast this for 2 mana, it does nothing. I guess your opponent's -1 samurai token, so the next time they make a samurai token, you get to rip it up or something, but don't actually do that. But if you cast it for 2 mana, it does nothing. If you cast it for 3 mana, you get a 2/2 vigilance menace haste, and the menace only sticks around until end of turn. Not very good. Like maybe that would be good in original Kamigawa 20 years ago, but in 2022, I think for 3 mana, you want more than a 2/2 with menace and haste and vigilance. At 4 mana on an empty board, that's probably its sweet spot. At 4 mana on an empty board, you get 2 2/2s with menace, haste, and vigilance. Your opponent gets 1, but since your stuff has menace, your opponent can't actually block it. So on an empty board, at 4 mana in specific, this is kind of like a heroic reinforcement. So you don't get to pump your entire team, but you're getting those 2 2/2 tokens that can smash your opponent for 4 damage. And then as it scales further, it kind of scales a little bit like a volcanic geyser. Like if you cast this for X = 4 or 5, you're getting in 6 damage. At 6 or 7, you're getting in 8 damage. This is again assuming you're on a completely empty board. If you cast it for a ton of mana on an empty board, it's going to deal a ton of damage to your opponent's face, and you get to keep those tokens around, which is nice. The problem is how often, even on turn 4, like a heroic reinforcements, are you going to have an empty board? And the answer is not very often. And if your opponent has any other creatures on the battlefield, it's going to make this card so much worse. Each creature they have allows the samurai that they make to block one of your menacers, so all of a sudden this card could be benefiting you much more than it's benefiting your opponent. We're just looking at the top 10 creatures in Standard. These are creatures that profitably block a 2/2 token, plus you add in the samurais you're giving your opponent, and it is hard for me to imagine pretty much any deck wanting Agino Uprising. It gets way worse in Commander because you're giving your opponents tons of tokens unless you're playing some sort of weird dagger burn group slug, give your opponent stuff, and then hurting them with a deck. So how could we actually make this card work? There's two ways that I could see it maybe being worth it in Standard. One would be some sort of weird Boros control deck, where the idea is to maybe use like Invoke Calamity to instant speed a Wrath, like a Doomscar or Blood on the Snow, blow up all the creatures, untap, and just dump all your mana into this, and then you're getting a ton of damage. Like, sure, your opponent's getting tokens too, but hopefully you're just winning the game on the spot. The other way it could be kind of interesting is with Meat Hook Massacre. Like, maybe giving all of your opponent's tokens is fine because you're going to Meat Hook Massacre them away. The other way you could try to do this is by leveling up Paladin class or flipping Wedding Announcement, getting some sort of anthem on the battlefield to make your samurais stronger than your opponent's samurais, but really, it is hard for me to imagine this card can see any play. Also worth mentioning, another reason I really dislike this card is if you look at samurais in Kamigawa, their entire gimmick is this pseudo-exalted thing. Many of them have abilities that care about you attacking alone. With a single samurai, a single warrior, then you get benefit. You're getting, extra combat stabs, casting enchantments or artifacts from your graveyards, tapping stuff. So what samurai really want you to do is smash your opponent with one big samurai to get these triggers. Agino Uprising does the exact opposite of that. It goes super wide, which I guess still works with like Ryu because you get an extra combat stab, but really it kind of is a non-bow with the main samurai mechanic in the set. So Agino Uprising, flavor is cool, I guess, but otherwise, I think this is just one of the worst cards that we've seen from all of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. We also got the black land in the channel cycle, Take Numa, Abandoned Mire. So Take Numa comes into play untapped, it's legendary, it adds a black mana, and its channel ability is 4 mana, discard it, mill 3 cards, and return a creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand, cost less if you have some legends. So Take Numa, on one hand, I think this is one of the less powerful of these channel lands. Like, it's fine being able to get back a creature or a planeswalker, kind of like part of an Aid the Fallen, and it's on a land, which is insane. But if you compare it to Boseiju or Wara, which I think are just really, really busted, especially in older formats, I think this is a little less powerful. On the other hand, that doesn't really matter. It's still a land that comes into play untapped. It still does something relevant. Like, you can exchange your extra land that you don't need for a creature or planeswalker in your graveyard, which is still really, really powerful. I think the biggest difference is, Take Numa, you do need creatures and planeswalkers in your deck to really take advantage of it. When stuff like Boseiju, Otawara, they can show up in literally any deck and be good. You do need at least some creatures to really want Take Numa. However, it's still a really good card. I think it ranks behind the other members of the cycle so far, but I still think this is a card that is going to see play in a lot of decks. Every commander deck that can afford a land that only taps for black mana and isn't fetchable is going to play this card. It's going to show up in a lot of standard decks. I think certain like modern and legacy decks could play it as well. So a little bit below the ultra stable level, but still, all these cards are insane. Take Numa is no exception. Lands that come into play tapped and do spell things are just some of the most powerful cards in all of Magic, and even if it ranks behind like the truly busted ones that are going to shake up eternal formats, Take Numa, still a really good card. On the other hand, we got one of the best sagas I think we've seen from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, the Restoration of Agino. So Restoration of Agino, 3 mana white saga. Lore counter 1, so when it enters a battlefield, you get to search your library for a basic planes, put it in your hand. Lore counter 2, you can discard a card. If you do, reanimate a permanent mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Lore counter 3 flips it around into a 3/4 vigilance creature that when it attacks or blocks, you get a 1/1 colorless spirit token. So this is a little bit like a Birth of Meletis, a saga that saw quite a bit of play when it was in standard, where you're getting this, land tutoring, then you're not getting a a wall, but maybe you're reanimating a creature from your graveyard, getting this mini Sun Titan, and then you get a somewhat reasonable creature. Like a 3/4 Vigilance isn't bad. Like, sure, you're probably not getting it till like turn 6, so it might be outclassed on the battlefield, but still, it's not a bad backside. We've also seen Ambitious Farmhand see a lot of play, and that's another interesting comparison. If you think about how searching through planes and then the second lore counter with reanimation actually works, this is kind of like a weird slow rampant growth in white, because what you can do is 2-drop a planes with lore counter 1, lore counter 2, discard that planes, and then just put it on the battlefield, and you're essentially ramping. That's kind of turning this into rampant growth that costs 3 mana and has suspend 1 more or less before you actually get to land on the battlefield. But still, I mean, it's white. White can't be too picky when it comes to wrap. Plus, you have all the other upsides where you could be reanimating a non-land, and it is worth pointing out, you can discard the card and then immediately reanimate it. So that's another trick. Maybe you have an Ambitious Farmhand, rather than spending mana on it, you just discard it, put it into play, which is kind of a nice little twist on this saga. And, I mean, like I was talking about before, we do have a lot of cheap things that are worth reanimating. Think about, like, some of the black-white decks that are just grinding out value with Eye Twitches, Professor of Symbology, Shambling Gas. Those are all really nice reanimation targets for Restoration of Agino. And then, once this flips around, it kind of reminds me a lot of Brimaz, honestly. Like, sure, it's not happening until pretty late in the game. Turn 5, you're getting the flip. Turn 6, you can attack with it. And the token you make doesn't have to be attacking or blocking, which might actually be an upside. One of the things with Brimaz is a lot of times the token just kind of chump attacks and dies immediately. That's not going to happen with Architect, but Brimaz is a pretty powerful card. We'll have to see if the slowness of getting to Architect of Restoration is a deal breaker. But, I mean, a 3/4 Vigilance that makes tokens when it attacks or blocks, that's actually a pretty legitimate card because Brimaz has seen play all the way back to Modern in the past. So the Restoration of Agino, actually one of these new sagas that I'm highest on actually seeing play. Like, it kind of does a little bit of everything. It can ramp you and make sure you hit your land drops at a minimum. You could reanimate other things, and then the backside is actually a pretty reasonable creature as a bonus. But unfortunately, not all the new sagas can be winners. We also got Inspired Iteration, and this one I'm not as hyped for. So 4 mana, lore counter 1, return up to 1 target creature planeswalker to its owner's hand. Lore counter 2, return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. If you can't, draw a card, and then you flip it around into Living Inspiration, which is actually kind of a cute enchantment creature, Moonfolk. A 3/3 with flying that says when you cast a spell, your opponents can't cast spells with the same mana value of that spell until your next turn. So essentially, if you cast a 1-drop, until your next turn, your opponents can't cast a 1-drop. Same with 2-drops, 3-drops, etc., etc., etc. So I think the backside is cool, and it would be fun to build some sort of like standard prison deck where you build around that. However, my problem with this card is the front side seems incredibly bad. So it's 4 mana. 4 mana, if you think about the effects that you're getting out of this card, lore counter 1 is essentially a very slightly upgraded Fading Hope. A Fading Hope that's sorcery speed, so that's a drawback, but it can bounce a Planeswalker, which is a slight upside. So I would say that's essentially a 1 mana effect. Like, sorcery speed, bounce a creature or Planeswalker, I would guess that would cost a single mana. Lore counter number 2, return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. We already know that's a 1 mana effect at sorcery speed. Ritual of Restoration is literally that at sorcery speed. I guess you have the upside that if you don't have an artifact in your graveyard, then you can draw a card instead. Although you can't choose to draw a card. If you have an artifact, you gotta get it back. You can't choose a random draw instead. And if you add those two things together, that just makes me incredibly skeptical of this card. Like, why would I want to pay 4 mana for 2 1-mana effects? And it's even worse than that because it's got the slowness of it. These 1-mana effects are happening over the course of multiple turns. So the front side is just so bad that even though I think the back side of this card is fun, Living Inspiration, as I mentioned, just like play a diversity of mana values, play cheap cantrips, consider, Expressive Iteration, Behold the Multiverse, and try to play this prison plan once it flips around. Like, that is a really neat idea, and I really love that idea, but the front side is just so underpowered that it's hard for me to imagine this being anything more than like a fun against the odds card. It seems unlikely that it can do anything more than that, because who wants to pay 4 mana for a Fading Hope and then a Ritual Restoration? We also got the blue member of the Invoke cycle. Invoke Gales. So Invoke Gales, 5 mana, 4 of it blue, gain control of target artifact or creature, untap it. So Invoke Gales calls back to Confiscation Coup, which was actually a card that saw quite a bit of playback in Energy Standard. Kind of does the same thing. You don't get to untap the permanent, which is a little bit different, and you have to pay energy for it. Invoke Gales doesn't have those hoops, but it does have the drawback of requiring a lot of blue mana, and I think this card could actually be kinda reasonable either as a sideboard option or maybe in the main deck, in the right deck. We recently played this weird mono blue, like Mind Flayer, just the strangest pile of mono blue cards on stream like a couple of weeks ago. I can imagine Invoke fitting right in there as well. Like if you're snagging a Azeka's Chariot or some of the new Dragon Spirits or maybe an Edgar, like that's pretty good value. It's kind of a walking 2-for-1 because it's better than removal in a lot of situations. And blue is a color that doesn't get great removal, so you gotta evaluate it through the context of blue removal, where blue just doesn't straight up kill things. Stealing a creature is basically as close as blue can get to actually killing something. Same with killing an artifact. Like just stealing it is probably the best you're going to do in a blue deck. Plus you get the 2-for-1 potential because then you have that creature. You can block with it. You can attack with it. If it dies, you're going to get its triggers. So I think that Invoke Gales, at least as a sideboard card, maybe in the main deck could be really good. If you want to go full on meme mode, copying this a bunch of times sounds kind of hilarious. Like we got Galvanic iteration in standard, 2 of these, 3 of these, stealing all your opponent's stuff, 1,000-Year Storm. Like imagine ending your 1,000-Year Storm chain with Invoke the Gales and just stealing all of your opponent's artifacts, all of their creatures. The only problem I see in standard is it does line up pretty bad with some of the white cards, like Redain taxing it, Thalia taxing it, Elite Spellbinder taxing it. Like that makes this effect much, much worse. But I still think that is just a way to snag your opponent's best thing for 5 mana. In your mono blue deck that doesn't have good removal, this is going to have a shot. The other place I think this is going to be an all-star is in Theft-style commander deck. Send triplets, Nihilor, Zara, Dragonlord, Sumgar, Rubinia, Soulslinger. Like, if the theme of your deck is stealing your opponent's stuff and turning it against them, Invoke Gales is great. Like, it gets anything. There's no restriction on it. There's no needing energy, which is a pretty rare effect. And unlike other mind control style effects, it's not an enchantment sitting on the battlefield or control magic. It's not sitting on the battlefield waiting for the enchantment to die to give your opponent the thing back. As a sorcery, this yoinks the creature or the artifact forever. So I think Theft-style commander decks definitely want it as well. So Invoke Gales, I like it. It's a narrow card. It's only going to go in specific decks, which is probably mostly mono blue decks thanks to its mana cost. But in mono blue, where you don't have great removal, I think this is going to be in the conversation, if not in the main deck, at least in the sideboard in standard. Plus, you get all that fun commander potential as well. We also got an interesting new removal spell / recursion spell in Soul Transfer. So 3 mana, black sorcery, choose one, or if you have an artifact and an enchantment, you get to do both, exile target creature or planeswalker, or return target creature or planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. So if you think about what this card is, it's essentially a sorcery speed heroes downfall that exiles, combined with a, I don't know, an Aid the Fallen, not quite Aid the Fallen, because Aid the Fallen can get back both the creature and a planeswalker when Soul Transfer only gets one. Raise Dead, I guess, that can also hit planeswalkers. How good is this card? And I think the answer is, it's good if your deck can have an artifact and an enchantment. I think either one of these modes by itself isn't super exciting. I mean, I guess having the flexibility is a nice bonus. Sometimes you're up against a control deck that doesn't have any creatures or planeswalkers, and you can use the get back a creature or planeswalker mode. So it's gonna never really be a dead card, but really we have literal heroes downfall in standard, and that doesn't really see much play. It's hard for me to imagine a sorcery speed version, even with the upside of exiling, it's gonna be like a true staple, even with the extra stuff tacked on. On the other hand, if you are a deck that probably has an artifact and an enchantment on the battlefield, then this card is great. Like, if you can get both modes, this is just a walking 2-for-1. Even at sorcery speed, 2-for-1s are pretty powerful in Magic, and I think we already have the perfect deck for this. Actually, the perfect deck for this might be the best deck in standard post-bannings, which is white-black control. The white-black control decks, they kind of accidentally end up with artifacts and enchantments on the battlefield just by playing the cards they already want in their deck. They're playing Shambling Gas and Deadly Disputes, which make treasure tokens that are artifacts. Then they're playing like Wedding Announcements, Meat Hook Massacres, which just happen to be enchantments. So I think in a deck like that, in the white-black control deck, I think this is certainly in the conversation. And it even fits the theme of the deck. You want to be getting back your Lulz or your Sorens. You want to be getting rid of your opponent's stuff, and you get rid of it permanently so your opponent can't reanimate it or whatever. So I think in the right deck, this is going to be an all-star. The white-black control deck, maybe the mono-black control deck, that's where this this card can really shine. On the other hand, if you look at like Goldspan Dragon, that's where you can really see the problem with being a sorcery. Goldspan Dragon in specific, Hero's Downfall, sure, your opponent's still going to get a treasure, but at least you're not going to take a hit from Goldspan and give your opponent a token for getting hit. Something like Soul Transfer, you got to take the Goldspan hit, and you give your opponent a treasure for them attacking, and then on your turn, you got to spend your mana trying to kill it, and they get another treasure, and they probably have a counter, and it's going to be really bad. So it is a drawback, although exiling is an upside. I mean, we're getting these new Dragon Spirits with death triggers. Being able to exile something like Junji rather than kill it with Hero's Downfall, that's actually a big upside. Plus, we have reanimation stuff. We were just talking about some of the grindy Orzhov decks, the Blood on the Snow style decks. We're getting Invoke Justice, so maybe we have Reanimator style decks. So there's certainly some upsides to exiling compared to destroying. So overall, I think that Soul Transfer is good, but because it's a sorcery, I don't think it's like true staple level good. I think that if you have an artifact and an enchantment, this card's going to be great in your deck. So those white-black control style decks in specific. On the other hand, if you're only choosing one mode, then I'm a little bit skeptical. We'll have to wait and see. If we got a ton of the Dragon Spirits running around, other things that really need to be exiled, this could be good. But the fact that we have Hero's Downfall and it just really doesn't see play anymore, that makes me a little bit skeptical that this card is going to really break out and be a standard staple. So I think this is more of an archetype staple than a format staple, but still in the right deck, a really powerful effect. We also got an uncommon, but this card is so insane, we had to talk about it individually. Anchored to Reality, 4 mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sack an artifact or creature, search your library for an equipment or a vehicle card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. If its mana value is less than the sacrifice permanence value, scry 2. This is essentially fixed Tinker. If you know anything about the history of Magic, Tinker is one of the most broken cards in the game's entire history. Tinker is 3 mana, sack an artifact, search up an artifact, put it in play. Anchored to Reality is essentially a fixed version of one of the most busted cards that has ever been printed in the game's entire history. A card that's banned literally across formats. Like, it is so absurd. Anchored to Reality, it's certainly worse. It's 1 more mana, and it only gets equipment or vehicles, but still, anytime you have a card that can tutor something directly from your library, you gotta take note of this, and there are good things to get with this card. Like, Anchored to Reality can be getting Caldera Complete in a format like Modern or Commander. Sack your random Mem Knight, get a Caldera Complete, smash your opponent, and get Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. Another pretty powerful effect. It's kind of hilarious with Elbrus the Binding Blade. Elbrus, its downside is its mana cost is super high. It's only 1 to equip though, and then you flip around into this massive 13/13 Wintengar. Anchored to Reality is perfect for making that work as well. So I think this card's going to see play. I think this card's going to see play in Commander decks, any equipment style Commander deck, like Galea or Dalikos or Rafik style Voltron decks. If you are in blue and playing a bunch of equipment, this card is just kind of insane. Good for vehicle Commander decks, and I wouldn't even be shocked if this card could see play in a format like Modern or a format like Standard. We'll have to see how many more good vehicles we get. If we get some really expensive high-end equipment or vehicle, then this obviously gets better. But I think that this has a shot. Even as a bad Tinker, a fixed Tinker, it's still very close to a Tinker, and I think that's going to make this card pretty scary in certain decks. Finally, rounding out our lower rarity cards today, we got a bunch of limited only stuff, but there are a couple I wanted to mention individually. We got our Black Shrine, Go Shanti of the Hidden Cruelty, some repeatable removal for a Shrine deck, so if you're playing Shrines, probably going to be really good there. Otherwise, pretty useless. Prosperous Thief, kind of a sweet ninja. You can ninjutsu it for just 2 mana, and when a ninja or rogue hits your opponent, you get to make a treasure token. 1 or more ninjas or rogues. So keep that in mind. You're only getting 1 from hitting an opponent, but still, if you're looking for some ramp in your ninja commander deck or your rogue commander deck, this is probably going to be a good addition. Maybe has a chance in Standard. We've seen cheap treasure production be really, really good in its own weird roundabout way. This is kind of a 2 mana treasure producer, like a Prosperous Innkeeper in a ninja form. Fang of Shigeki, actually probably going to see some play in Standard. 1 mana 1/1 Death Touch, enchantment creature Snake Ninja. We've seen other very similar cards. 1 mana 1/1 Death Touch actually see a reasonable amount of sideboard play because they're really good to bring in against decks that are just playing big ground creatures. It's kind of like a removal spell almost. So I wouldn't be surprised if this sees some play in that role as well. Essence Capture was really good last time it was in Standard. 2 mana counter a creature spell, put a counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Last time though, that was Curious Obsession Standard, so it has had this ready-built mono blue tempo home. We don't really have that at the moment, but who knows, maybe with Delver of Secrets, maybe there could be something similar developed, so worth keeping in mind. At a minimum, enormous energy blade, kind of a funny meme sword. It is really heavy, so heavy that when you equip it to give +4/+0, you gotta tap the creature that it equips, which is a pretty big drawback, so it's really slow, but still +4/+0 with only 2 mana to equip. Who knows, maybe there's a deck that can stick it on a flyer or something. The rest of the stuff, I think mostly just limited only fodder. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers for today. So let me know what you think about all these sweet new cards. What are you most hyped for? Let us know in the comments. Again, if you haven't checked out our exclusive spoiler video, it's linked in the description. You should check that out as well. And if you're looking for the latest previews, you can find them all over at MTGpreviews.com. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more spoiler coverage? Well, every single day during spoiler season, we have a daily spoiler video. You can check out the last two here and here.